Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversations with other writers. Walt Bosse is an associate professor of English at Brusher University in Owensboro, Kentucky, where he teaches courses in literature and writing. He recently contributed an article titled, "Oh Man, I'm Nowhere, Ralph Ellison and the Psychospatial Terrain of Mid-Century Harlem," to the volume Spatial Literary Studies, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Space, Geography, and the Imagination, published by Routledge in 2021. His other recent scholarship includes a chapter on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and HBO's The Wire, and the edited collection titled Popular Modernism and Its Legacies, From Pop Literature to Video Games, published by Bloomsbury in 2018. He also published articles that theorized the work of American modernists such as Ernest Hemingway and Charles W. Chestnut. Walt holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from the University of Cincinnati, the city where he was born and raised. He is passionate about scholarship in the humanities and considers himself fortunate to contribute his observations about cultural artifacts to a broad and diverse intellectual community. And this is my conversation with Walt.
Hi, Andy. Doing well. How are you?
Hanging in there. What are you working on now, and what motivated the project?
Right now, I'm kind of juggling two different projects, one more so than the other, but I'll talk about both of them. The first is a study of a few selected works of African-American fiction from the early and mid 20th century, vis-a-vis their portrayal of aviation, flight, and flying. So there's this term that historians have developed to try to approximate what it would have literally felt like to inhabit the early decades of the 20th century and to see airplanes for the first time. And they call this term Air-Mindedness, that people were suddenly seeing and hearing about these things that literally never existed before in human history. And, the equivalent would be looking out the window and seeing a UFO floating next to your house or your apartment. And so there has been some effort in the critical literature to look at works of fiction, mainly in England, produced in England, that show poets and writers of fiction also having a kind of air-mindedness and thinking about planes and flying and human potentiality and the relationship between people and technologies. But very little work along those lines has been done in America, and specifically very, very little in terms of minority discourses and the way that air-mindedness may or may not have impacted consciousness for Black Americans. So more specifically, the paper starts with an investigation of Richard Wright's Native Son, published in 1940. And it really is a very kind of intentional treatment of that novel in that I focus on a specific passage that takes place towards the beginning of the book. Most of the critical attention to Native Son has to do with, how overdetermined, how chaotic, how awful life experience is for the protagonist. This passage actually is a bit more of a quieter moment in the narrative that features Bigger and his friend Gus stepping out from a tenement building onto the very chaotic streets of Chicago, but they look up and they observe an airplane in the act of skywriting. It's putting an ad up in the sky to buy a certain type of gasoline. And there are several pages that encompass this particular scene that really kind of dramatize the way that the character is processing flight and thinking about his own human subject position below on the ground. And he very much wants to be up there and sees himself as being potentially a fit pilot if he didn't live in a caste system that would forbid such a thing for him socially. And so there is, over the course of the passage, an increasing or growing sense of resentment that he feels. And throughout the rest of the book, the second section of the book is titled Flight. So it's a kind of continuation of this contrast. And that's really how Wright uses flight and air-mindedness in the way that Bigger experiences it, is that it works by way of contrast. It really emphasizes his lockdown status on the ground the limitations against his potentiality as a human being, right? And it really does sort of play into the whole naturalist element of the book. All right, so it's like this glittering lure that he'll never be able to obtain to because of who he is. In 1977, Toni Morrison revisits Air-Mindedness in Song of Solomon, where flight and flying take on much more, I think, radical or dynamic properties. The end of the book actually ends very magically realistic kind of note where the reader is left to kind of choose how to interpret Milkman Dead's flight at the end. Is he falling? Is he flying? Is he dying? It's uncertain. But throughout that book, there is this sort of persistent reference to the myth of the flying African, and flight and flying and Milkman's own obsession with airplanes and flying are less like Biggers insofar as it doesn't emphasize Milkman's status as a minority in a caste system. It's actually more about finding out who he is as a human subject who's inherited this tradition and this culture, and it's much more about finding his roots in a way. So it's like Morrison is appropriating Air-Mindedness from Wright and kind of transforming it and making it more of an empowering experience, using the metaphor for this character to actually find himself. What I'm currently moving towards is a consideration of flight, flying, and air-mindedness in the way that Nike appropriates and commodifies the experience with Air Jordan in the 1990s and at the turn of the millennium, because that was a wildly successful and continues to be a wildly successful marketing campaign. But what I find fascinating is that it is another example in the pop cultural world of commodities objects, an example where air-mindedness plays a central role in selling these products to the Black community. And so I'm trying to kind of parse what to do with sort of this corporate appropriation of air-mindedness next to Morrison's very artful appropriation of it from Richard Wright's Native Son. So it's sort of like this kind of trans-historical 20th century study of a feeling about the sky, and in the way that we're left with it in a pair of shoes that are $150 a piece, and it's been sort of blown out of proportion and taken in a whole different realm. So I'm kind of in the thick middle of that one, and I'm very excited about it. In fact, I have to thank the folks at a conference that I attended in March for sort of pushing me in that latter direction and thinking about Nike as having something to do with all of this air-mindedness business. So that was cool. It was good feedback to get there. The other project that I'm less in the thick middle with and more kind of thinking about has to do with decay in the fiction of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and thinking about, again, potentiality. Most of this paper will deal with his 1934 novel Tender is the Night, which famously features the decay, or as the novel would put it, dissipation of its primary protagonist, Dick Diver, who, because of his own vices and alcoholism, he ends up kind of falling away from the world by the end of the book, in stark contrast to his wife, Nicole, whose energies grow and she realizes her potential. And I think that's one of the more beautiful aspects of that book, is her growth and maturity. A lot of critics have talked about Fitzgerald's own anxieties or fears about his own ability to produce text, right? And so there has been a lot of literature, a lot of scholarly literature produced that reads biographically Dick Diver's decline as a dramatization of Fitzgerald's own fears about his own ability to produce novels as good as The Great Gatsby. But what I've been finding is that there are also short stories that feature the language of decay. Again, words like dissipation would be a word that would have been used probably more often in the 1920s. One, because of prohibition, and dissipation has a lot to do with what then modernists perceived to be the damaging effects of alcohol abuse or drug abuse generally. And so you have these stories where you have characters who are dissipating. In fact, in Babylon Revisited, he presents a straight up definition of what it means to dissipate, and then there's this kind of beautiful long sentence about this character's own feeling of his own undoing. And so this is an effort to look at like the language of dissipation. And I'm interested about the fact I'm noticing that some of these stories, One Trip Abroad stands out, uses racialized kind of language to emphasize white dissipation over minority decay. It tends to be, Fitzgerald tends to present it as a specifically white experience. He was an avid reader of Karl Marx, and he thought about the changing systemic aspects of society, and I think some of these characters, in the way that they experience their own decline, are kind of dramatizing on a larger scale some of these shifts or paradigmatic changes that he might have been thinking about in a kind of socio-political way. And a lot of that in America obviously has to do with the racial caste system. And so whiteness tends to be under erasure or subject to decay and dissipation in a more prominent way in a lot of these narratives than Blackness does.
So what have you learned about yourself through scholarly writing or the research process, particularly with these projects that you're working on now, and then more generally as a scholar?
With these projects now and more generally, I've discovered that I often need more time than I allow myself to write. I guess it's a form of procrastination. I don't know. It's not a bad thing, but I tend to think and I take some notes, and then I think, and then of course I've got to go teach 4 classes, and then I come back and I'm tired, and then the days roll on and I've not typed anything into the document. And so I think I've learned that I need more time, and I need to get out in front of it more often than I allow myself to do. It's not necessarily like putting it off. It's just phasing into that next active level of actually sitting and producing words. It's like the project is happening. It exists. I can talk about it. And I think I'm talking about it pretty clearly, at least clearly enough to be able to write about it. It's just actually, pushing into that next level. And I'm well aware of the fact that the writing process is, multi-phases, right? You've got to think, you've got to write, you've got to draft, you've got to rewrite and revise and edit. And so I think being aware of where those transitions take place and when to capitalize on a moment of time that I might have to push into that next level, that's something that I've definitely learned to try to be in tune with. I also think I've become aware and learned about myself that with a lot of these projects, they're definitely like, you're talking about complex ideas, and they're definitely many layered. But I think it's also a lot of us as academics tend to overcomplicate things that are already complicated enough. And so in thinking so much about a project and taking so many notes, that I've had a tendency to actually overcomplicate something that really you need to do the opposite. You've got to kind of like simplify, right? To quote Thoreau, right? To bring it down to size and to say, I have this one thing that I want to contribute. It's this one, I'm trying to say one thing here, not all of these things, right? Because I've got 25, 30 pages to do it in, got to do justice to the artifact and to the context and all of that. Those are things, but really I've got one thing that I want to the reader to take away. And I guess I need to remind myself that this is really about one thing, not about all of these other things that I'm trying to illuminate as well. So trying not to overcomplicate something that's already complicated enough is something that I try to avoid if I can.
What's the role or responsibility of scholarship or scholarly writing? What keeps you generating material? Why do scholarship? Why write?
It's a good question. Partly it's, I don't know, out of habit or professional obligation, that you have to, it's part of the job that you've got to produce text and write these articles, book chapters, essays, whatever you want to call them, book length projects. So it's partly like out of a obligation, habit kind of thing, which is, that's not a bad thing. Super lucky to be able to have that as a part of, the job qualifications. And partly also for me, I write partly because if I feel like if I discontinue the practice, it will go away or something, right? It will diminish. And so I'm compelled just out of practice. And I guess this is part of the habit thing, but to make it just a lifestyle, an aspect of one's lifestyle, that you do this. This is part of your daily, is that you write for a bit or a lot. and or not at all. But you think about it, in either case, it's like making it a part of your lifestyle eliminates that fear or anxiety that it's going to go away if you don't practice the thing. So it's, a kind of self-sponsored deal where you want to just be in good practice and get better. And that's one of the cool things about writing when you've been doing it for a long time, to not just reread stuff that you wrote a long time ago and compare it to what you just recently published and say, oh, I've gotten better, but to actually like sense it and to feel like that you have more finesse, that you have more experience, and you've gotten more feedback from people, and that you are actually making improvements. I think it's awesome to look at, writers who have been doing it for decades and decades and decades, who are, getting on in years, who are better and better and better every time, right? Like Kurt Vonnegut, for example, somebody who's just effortlessly improving as a human writer, from beginning to end, right? I find those types of writers to be very motivating. And the fact that this is a craft or a practice that you can always get better at is, I think, a really cool thing to remind yourself of. You're not just repeating the same thing over and over again, even though you're practicing the same genre, which is typically for me mostly the essay, but to know that you can change it up, and it'll be different next time. It'll be better. It'll be a different subject, a different, modify your style. But the fact that this is a craft or a practice that can age and become refined over the course of a life career is really cool. So that's partly why I continue also, so that I can actualize that. And then of course there's, partly out of the belief that writing and language are arguably the only medium we have to create and share a shared understanding of the world. And if you don't do it, then I don't know what would happen. So there's that too. I guess that's the more philosophical element.
When you're struggling in research or writing for whatever reason, what strategies do you use to get yourself back to the page?
That's a good one. That's a good question. I read very intentionally to try to not generate ideas necessarily, but just to be processing at that other level. I do some free writing. I have notebooks. In recent years, journaling has really helped me to stay active in just producing language, even if it has nothing to do with my discipline or the project in question. Just to be writing, I find to be helpful, generative. I do a lot of concept mapping too as part of the journaling process. Once I get back into thinking, more intentionally about the project at hand, that helps me out a lot as well. I'm a really tactile person. I like to actually practice writing by hand if I can. I get a pencil, Ticonderoga, always, and I take notes, right? And it's sort of like the physical act of writing that helps me get back into it if I've fallen away from it, or if I'm stumbling with something, or I'm up against a wall and I can't quite see my way out of it. Printing off 4 pages of that middle of the essay that's problematic and turning to it with a pencil is very helpful for me. I can't do screens for too long. It does something to my cognition where I've got to step away from it. And so stepping away with actual pencils and pieces of paper are practical ways for me to kind of sidestep the writer's block.
What is your favorite part of the writing or research process, and why?
So it used to be that I really relished what we were talking about before, which is like the very early stage of a project where you've got the cool idea and you see that it has possibilities as an essay to be published, or an article or a book chapter. And then you spend that early phase kind of thinking and the ideas percolate. I used to really, really, really love, and I still do, that early phase. It's sort of like the honeymoon phase of a project where you have the liberty to think without a deadline in front of you. But more and more, the more I do it, I really enjoy being smack in the middle of a project, continuing. I don't get all my research and have it just there and reference and then I'm writing. The research and writing happen very much together at the same time for me once I get going. So being, in the very middle of a project and then realizing that you can see the outcome, that you can see the conclusion, right? 10 pages, 15 pages in advance, where you get to that thick middle where it feels tight and difficult and very hard. And then being able to have that moment where you see, okay, now it's going to go this way. And it's getting to that point that I really enjoy, because it doesn't happen in advance. I don't do outlining a lot. I try to just roll with what I've got in an abstract and kind of punch it out as I develop the idea. So it's getting to that sort of thick middle where it feels tense and difficult intellectually, but then also having that moment where it's okay, it will turn this way, and that's how it's going to end. And that's part of like the work, I guess, that I enjoy. It's like I really much enjoy like the work of writing. Like it is a labor. It's something that you have to like we said before, practice a lot to do in any kind of meaningful way. And it feels really thick and tense up here a lot of the time when you're in that middle part, but that's when you're getting smarter, right? Your brain is creating new neural pathways, and that's why it feels difficult. And like, I guess knowing that now, I love that part of it more so than I did when I was a younger writer, for sure.
What revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful when revising your own work, and why? What sort of problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
I kind of touched on this already earlier, but printing things out, I hate to say it, but I kill a lot of trees with this strategy. But printing off X number of pages and turning to it with a pencil and rewriting on a separate sheet of paper and then going back, typing again, that's a must for me. Being able to see it on the page and not on the screen. It's a totally different thing for me. And I know a lot of people are different and it's a one-to-one relationship, screen to paper. But for me, it's like in terms of processing it cognitively, in order for it to really fully be real, I've got to have it in hand. And so revising, doing that heavy lifting work of refining the idea and clarifying things, I've got to do it with a pencil in hand. So that's one strategy, practically speaking, that I implement. And I often find myself also reading out loud the words that I've written, and I encourage my students to do this too, but nobody ever takes me up on that one, as far as I know. But it really does help me to hear it, for it to be present. We were talking earlier about overcomplicating things, and many academics are guilty of verbose, overwrought sentences. And when you hear it, you can flag it, right? And then you've given yourself the opportunity to write it in a direct, declarative way. That's much more illuminating than the compound, complex constructions that so many of us tend to gravitate towards when we're juggling big ideas. So yeah, reading it out loud is a great strategy that has worked really well for me.
I completely agree with both of those things. Print it out, it's so much easier, especially when you're working on something that's a longer project and it's book length, without getting confused, because you can look at everything simultaneously, lay it out on the floor, move stuff around. Those movements are a lot easier. And absolutely 100% reading aloud, because part of what I do is also so performative, right? So it comes out of an oral tradition.
Yeah.
And I found in classrooms, it's easier to get them to take that activity home, the reading aloud activity home, if you do a practice of it, of a few pages in class, and then they get, all right, this is why I should be doing this thing.
Yeah.
It's going to help me catch these mistakes
Totally.
that I should have caught anyway.
Definitely.
What reading suggestions do you have? What scholars and/or creative writers do you keep in your back pocket?
Anything by Dennis Johnson. In terms of fiction, I'm really, really into Dennis Johnson right now. Train Dreams, the novella, one of my favorite books, and Tree of Smoke, the long novel about Vietnam, is a beautiful book. So in terms of creative writers, fiction, lately I've been gravitating towards Dennis Johnson's work. I mentioned Kurt Vonnegut earlier. Love everything by Vonnegut. And nonfiction, I would recommend a book that was published in 2016, 2017. It's called Against Everything. It's a collection of essays written by a scholar named Mark Grief. And what I love about this collection is that it's written very much for a public audience. It's not high theory, though it's motivated by many of the same impulses and instincts that shape high theory, but it's accessible and it's clear. He's been compared to Thoreau, that he has a very 21st century Thoreauvian vision of the world. And so I would definitely recommend this book. The title, Against Everything, makes it sound nihilistic and cynical, but it's not. There's definitely room for growth and progress and possibility in his vision of the world. And it's really interesting because he analyzes things that we do. It's cultural commentary. He makes references at times to works of literature and philosophy. Of course, he's, trained in those disciplines, literary criticism and philosophy both, but he applies that to human behavior in the world in which we live. So exercise is something that he analyzes and brings a really kind of fresh view of human customs and behaviors in the now, and kind of makes it pop in a way that you see it differently after reading the essay. It's also, I think, worth reading too for those of us who write essays, that this isn't a genre that requires as many formulas as have been given over to it in the teaching of essay writing. Yeah, there are certain expectations that people have, but Grief's prose is really effortless, is a word I used before to describe a different writer, but they're very easy to read, non-formulaic and eye-opening. And as I, practice essay writing in my own practice of it, I try more and more to free myself up from a lot of those kind of rigid expectations that people think this genre has, but it's fluid, right? And it can look and feel and be very different one essay to the next. And that's something that I appreciate about that book.
Thank you for all of those reading suggestions, and thank you for agreeing to be part of the series. I've learned so much and I've had an amazing time.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.